Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my workshop. Today I'm going to share all the juicy points that I've been able to collect in the 10 years now that I've been looking into these topics. And today's focus is going to be on the ancient culture, the Sumerian culture, which very interestingly enough has very strong biblical ties to the English and Old Hebrew Testament stories of man's interaction with their living gods. Okay, so where do we come from? I touched on this basically a little bit in my lecture, but the scientific viewpoints for where we come from always kind of have butted heads with either evolution or religious. And the scientific viewpoints are starting to push the notion that life more than likely arose on Earth from panspermia, that somehow life arrives whole and complete. There isn't enough time on the evolution of Earth scale, 4.5 billion years, something like that, 4.7, for life to have just whimsically come together in primordial soup and a lightning bolt striking it, and all of a sudden there's life. So one of the theories they're starting to push is that possibly life actually arrived at Earth whole and complete. So this is pushed further with the research that we've done by looking at asteroids and comets, things where we've actually sent out things in space with an aerogel catcher and collect fragments of debris from these and found, wow, here's carbon, and many of the minerals and things that we need for life to get started are found floating around in space and arrive here in the form of comets and asteroids. So one of the things that we can really start to look for with our science is to start to confirm life beyond just Earth. And one of those environments that could be very hospitable to life is one of the moons of Jupiter called Europa. Now, the reason why this is really interesting is many of the other moons, Ganymede, Callisto, there's four major moons of Jupiter, but Ganymede and Callisto have extensive volcanic activity. And Europa, as you can see here, has extensive water. Now, the surface is covered by a very thick ice sheet that you can see it's cracked here, and it's kind of almost like plate tectonics here on Earth, where the ice is always kind of shifting, and so it gives us a view of how this planet is working. But interestingly enough, Europa has a 40-mile deep ocean below this ice. So they theorize if we're able to, and we are, there's a mission coming up in 2007 to do just this, if we do penetrate this ice sheet and go down to the surface of the ocean on Europa, there could be processes taking place just like they're here on Earth. When we go way down into the ocean, no sunlight whatsoever, there are these vents emanating hot minerals and sulfur and various other elements where life is thriving. So you wouldn't think it would be possible without sunlight or heat, but here at the bottom of the ocean, where there's thermal vents exist, there's life thriving. So we just apply that same science to, here we have another ocean on one of our moons of Europa. Maybe this is a possible good habitable place for life to evolve as well. So as we look at the more specifically how we came into the picture, there's this overriding theory of the missing link. That everything so simplistic is going to become more complex, but for whatever reason, science has not been able to connect us to the Neanderthal man. So there's been all these successions of the hominoid, but nothing that can actually put us in a connection with them. So that they say that there's a missing link. At some point we're going to find some species that actually connects us to the Australopithecine and all these various other Neanderthal men that evolution says we come from. So when we look at many of these structures all over the Earth, Stonehenge and Egypt and Giza, we start to realize that there was a brilliance being displayed by ancient man that we don't attribute to them. That using stone tools and living in clay huts for the most part, they weren't able, as we would reckon, to be able to build such devices. But we still have all around the world evidence of them building and having a technology to build structures that we still can't even duplicate. And as an example here, we're looking at a quarry. There's a gentleman here. His name is Ted. He's one of our people selling videos in the in the other room. But he went on a trip where this is a quarry, and this is Baalbek in Lebanon. You can see another gentleman standing here by the rocks. And interestingly enough, these rocks, they're called trilithoton stones. They weigh like hundreds of tons. And this one was left at the quarry site, slightly broken, but it was 5 miles away from where they took these things into Baalbek and stacked them. So interestingly enough, they had the ability to cut out these rocks and quarry them out and move them 5 miles, where we still yet today don't really have technology that can cut a perfect rock out of the ground and move it, So it's very interesting that there are a lot of these types of artifacts around the world that show us that ancient man was somehow utilizing a type of technology that we still can't get our hands on how they were doing it. So one of the areas that's really sparked my interest in looking at all these structures, Giza, Nazca, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Tiwanaku, I really started to want to know, well, who's the first culture? Where does all of this come from? And this led me to the culture that we have evidence of that came literally right out of the Stone Age, where modern-day Iraq is, known as Mesopotamia, Babylon. But the first culture to show up there were called Sumerians. And this is right between the Tigris and Euphrates. That strip of land there, it's kind of hard to see. It's called Mesopotamia. But then Mesopotamia, Babylon, that's today's Iraq. And this culture has left us artifacts in the form of stone tablets, pictograms, some of their monuments that still exist. But for the most part, their evidence exists in two forms. One of them is a clay tablet, and another one is called a cylinder seal. What the Sumerians devised was an ingenious way of being able to have kind of like an ancient printing press, where what they would do is they would reverse carve a picture into this round cylinder seal. Now, scholars today still are baffled as to how they were able to carve in reverse such accurate pictures so that when you would roll it over wet clay, it leaves the positive imprint. So we have a lot of this information that was disseminated by the Sumerians on a daily basis about events, courts, laws, judges, schooling. So all of these things they recorded on stone tablets, and they also had a written language that was called cuneiform script. It consisted of over 400 characters, and it was basically like an oversized screwdriver that they would twist and turn it and make all these little characters called cuneiform script. Now, an alphabet with over 400 characters is pretty complex, and it's very interesting that the Sumerians, literally right out of the Stone Age, show up and are bequeathing us information that literally over 100 of the firsts needed for a modern culture came from the Sumerians. One of those things was mathematics. They had a base math of 6 and 10. Now, usually people will just round this off to say 60 sexagesimal, but it was actually the number 6 and the number 10 separately so that they could do very large and very small integers. They were the first ones to devise a metric system. They were the first ones to give 12 inches to the foot, 360 degrees to the circle, 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year, 60 seconds. All of these were derivatives of the number 12 and also the number 6. That number 12, though, is a key point that I'll stress here as you'll see as we go on. So myth or facts, one of the great scholars that we have who's really divulged into this research, now at 83, his name's Zecharia Sitchin, and he's one of the pinnacle researchers as a linguist of about 220 people in the world, 220 in the whole world that can actually directly read Sumerian cuneiform script. So Zecharia Sitchin has really taken on an interesting scholastic approach to information that modern linguists and archaeologists aren't quite ready to accept. Now, linguists today will squabble over the meaning of this word or the meaning of this phrase, but Zecharia Sitchin was one of the very few linguists to look at all of the information being told, all of the context, all of the meaning, and put it into a context that makes sense, that starts to combine science, but also explains where we come from, the religious aspects of this information. So I was really intrigued by the research that he's done. He's written a series of books called the Earth Chronicles. You can see a few of them here. Zecharia Sitchin is now 83 years old, so it's up to myself and many of the other younger generations to continue on and hold these principles to truth. So here's an evidence of cuneiform script. Sometimes they would write on semi-precious stones, but you can see it's a system of, again, little lines and triangles. But very interesting details of what they were describing. Now, they'll teach you in high schools or in the college institutions today that the Sumerians were the first ones to invent writing and the first ones to have mathematics. But they don't ever tell you specifically what they were writing or how extensive their knowledge really was. So one of the other information pieces that I've tried to focus on with the Sumerians is not only did they have a very vast knowledge of mathematics and science, education, they were also very aware of astronomy. And they were the first ones, for instance, to invent the 12 houses of the zodiac by dividing the heavens into 12 parts. They came up with a system so that at the time of helioidal rising, this is basically if you look out right when the sun is rising, the sun just in the in the very early morning is rising against the like the dark of space, and you can see a constellation what the sun is rising against. So if we see Aquarius or Sagittarius or Leo, what constellation the sun is rising against, you're in the age of Aquarius, you're in the age of Pisces. So they were able to devise a very ingenious way and knew about precession, this 25,000-year cycle, to bequeath all this information about astronomy so that now, when we have technology, we can start to look at this information and start to wonder, what were they trying to tell us? Now, along with this information about outer planets, the distance between the outer planets, what the planets look like in space, they very specifically give some information that when modern scholars and archaeologists first started doing excavations in Iraq, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, they started to pull out all of these artifacts where, in some cases, the Sumerians are talking about beings called the Anunnaki. And that term just means those who from heaven come to earth. But at the time, in the early 1900s, many of these scholars finding these artifacts and the Sumerians speaking of the Anunnaki, interaction with their living gods, talking about the outer planets. Scholars didn't quite understand this information, so they threw it all into a big myth pile and just left it untouched, as these are cultural mythologies coming from a culture that is not rooted in science. We're not going to even venture into the idea that they were actually visited by beings from another planet. Can't go there. So that's where modern scholarly views stop. But again, people like Zecharia Sitchin, myself, Eric von Daniken, and others will look at this information and say, well, what if they were trying to convey things that they only understood by the terms they had at the time? So if you see a flying object in the sky or a being coming out of a glowing ship to whatever effect, you're going to think of it as a god. Anything at that time flying in the skies was alive, a bird, an animal. So many of the artifacts that they've left us show us information that we have to look through the eyes of the ancient person to see what they were trying to tell us. But from a modern view, again, some of these things we can prove with our technology. And one of those, from the astronomical standpoint, was they had a very vigorous view about astronomy and tracked things that happened in our heavens over hundreds of years. Here's a tablet stored in the British Museum that shows observations of Venus. Here's another one that recorded natural weather events, things that were taking place. And this was, again, something that they would do over generations of time and pass this down as sacred information. Anyone who was able to read this information, it was a privilege. They had scribes and priests, and to be able to write cuneiform script was an honor. And so the information that was held by these priests was something that was very esoteric. One of the tablets, for instance, would be able to predict 50 years in advance on what specific day a lunar eclipse would take place. So they could know 50 years in advance, on this specific day, we're going to have a lunar eclipse. It's very interesting information. Again, another tablet just showing at some point where certain stars were in the sky and tracking their progression. So what really starts to raise the question is was ancient man visited by gods or possibly ancient astronauts? Many of the tales that we have in the biblical form of chariots of fire or Ezekiel's wheel, or Noah having interactions with a god telling him to build a craft. Many of these stories have a Sumerian counterpart where it's literally word for word the same tale, but told in a Sumerian script that's recorded in stone, unchanged. So to put that into perspective, we have the New King James English version of the Bible, but that has been translated from the New Testament to the Old Testament to various other Semitic languages as a compilation of the original tales told by the Sumerians, which we have in stone unchanged. So when we start to look at many of these texts that talk about angels in the Bible and depict the angels in the Bible with a halo and with wings, these aren't the first generation of these depictions. There's actually the Sumerian depictions that, again, predate the Hebrew God and the Christian God by thousands of years. And let me put it into perspective so you understand what I'm saying. We're in the year 2005, which is basically 2,000 years removed from when the time of Christ was here, AD to BC. So if you go back another 2,000 years from that point, you're at the time of the Abraham God. Go back another 2,000 years from that, 6,000 years, 4,000 BC, 6,000 years, and you're at the time of the Sumerians. So it's a good leap back in history. So a lot of the tales that we have in English just specifically talk about heaven. Heaven is up there somewhere, and the gods come from heaven. But this is actually a misnomer, because all of the references of the word heaven in the New King James Version are meant to just be conveying the skies. They're not talking about pearly gates up there with clouds, somewhere mythically. They're talking about the skies. So if we were to actually just replace the word heaven with skies, it really starts to bring in a lot more context for beings coming down from the skies. So many of the depictions that we still have left to us in ancient Iraq, this is actually a stellar that's held in Iran, show a time when the Sumerians had interaction with their living gods, which they called the Anunnaki. And here we see a depiction of an Anunnaki coming down on what the Sumerians depicted him as having the power of flight. So they are depicting him coming down and meeting a Sumerian king, and you can see the Sumerians underneath here holding up the view. Now, interestingly enough, I've kind of like to make a joke that, here's the king meeting the Sumerian god, and these must be the taxpayers making it possible for him to do this. But we have these wall reliefs all over the Middle East that show a connection, just like it spawned into Egyptian cultures, of the winged disc. This winged disc is the reference gave by the Sumerians of the Anunnaki, and that they had the power of flight. Now, again, if you're living in a clay hut and using stone tools, you're not going to know the difference between gods and extraterrestrials. So beings having the power of flight, they don't know how to depict that other than to say wings. Just like they would see in nature, a bird has wings, it has the power of flight. Another view of this stellar. Another thing I'd like to point out too is, a couple of years ago when I invaded Iraq again, one of those interesting points is we still don't know why. Weapons of mass destruction, oil, no. What was it? So there's been a lot of speculation from the ufological point of view that, interestingly enough, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Sumer, same place, is very aware of his heritage and his connection to the Anunnaki, and has done several things. Now this is just rumor and speculation, but had several things underway where he was actually trying to build like an Anunnaki theme park. And there have been diagrams and things found. I have a couple of connections military-wise of people in Iraq who have sent me some art pieces and things found in a couple of Saddam's palaces that show just very interesting connections where Saddam was aware of this information bequeathed by the Anunnaki. So some of the artifacts here, again, you can see the detail. This is one of the gods that the Sumerians depicted as Ishtar, also known as Inanna, and she was known to roam the skies of Earth. And there's an interesting tale that she was a very attractive female, a female god, and at some times she would choose male counterparts to bring up into her adobe and have sexual relations with them. But unfortunately, those men would always be killed afterwards. And there's a famous king that relays this tale in a Sumerian text. His name is Gilgamesh. And very interestingly, he talks about how Ishtar had her eyes upon him and invited him up and said, thank you, but no thanks, because of what you've been known to do with various other men who have come to visit you. So the interesting thing that I just point out here is that this is a typical wall relief the Sumerians left us of the Anunnaki. Basically, this specifically is an Anunnaki that was in charge of a spaceport. Now, this is information bequeathed to us by Zecharia Sitchin. Again, one of about 220 people in the world that can directly translate Sumerian cuneiform script. And what he's translated, the Sumerians are describing here one of their Anunnaki. And some of the things I'd point out is in his right hand he's holding the fruit of life and the water of life in the other hand. So these are again symbologies that we have for the Garden of Eden and the tree of life and the fruit and many of these things. And also I've kind of pointed out several times, you'll see around his wrist what as I would interpret it to be a watch. But back then the Sumerians wouldn't understand what technology is. So several of the wall reliefs that show these Anunnaki with some type of wristband, it looks more like of a floral pattern. Whether or not they were wearing just a wrist, a bracelet of some kind, I think it's very possible, just like with our state of technology, they might have had some type of small wrist device, and they're depicting that as accurately as they could in a stellar. But very interesting, when we look at the same symbology used by NASA, 6,000 years from now, I doubt that anyone's going to look at the Sumerian depictions of the Anunnaki and try and really question what they were saying. I don't think you can hear that. It's not loud enough, but
we copy it down, Eagle. The Eagle has landed.
But when we land on the moon, the first thing that they say is the Eagle has landed. So this symbology used by NASA is the same thing that the Sumerians were doing, showing the Anunnaki had the power of flight. 6,000 years from now, people aren't going to look at the Apollo 11 symbol and say, whoa, what were they doing, landing birds on the moon? No, they're going to understand that we were just symbolically saying we had the power of flight. Just like the Sumerians were showing us with the Anunnaki that they had the power of flight. So another interesting thing, again, with the tree of life, here we have a Sumerian tale with writing very specifically explaining what's going on and symbolic imagery explaining. And this tale talks about the tree of life. And interestingly enough, here at the very top of it, we have a male figure in some type of flying craft. Now, again, archaeologists looked at this as mythology and said, oh, they're just depicting, mythological tales of information. But when we start to analyze all of the information and put into context the knowledge they had from a scientific viewpoint, it's very possible if anyone's able to step beyond that one little hurdle and say, extraterrestrials do exist, there's enough evidence to look at this information in the light of saying, wow, the Sumerians had a vast amount of information. And if you were to ask them, how do you know all this information? They say, everything we know, we were taught by the Anunnaki. So here are some interesting cylinder seals and wall reliefs. These are held in the British Museum. I was able to hire a professional antiquities photographer a few years back who went to the British Museum in the Louvre in Paris, where they have the two largest collections of Sumerian artifacts online. I had him digitally photograph all these, and I have them stored on my xfax.com website so that through progression of years, we can still look at this, God forbid, if there's other wars and things, and we blow up what remnants of our heritage we have left in Iraq. There is still information that can be derived from this source, so that maybe there are medical advances or things about our genetic makeup that if they don't already know about it and are hiding it, maybe at some point we will be able to discover this and learn more about ourselves. And in doing so, you'll see by what the Sumerians have left us that it's very interesting information. Here's just a kind of a close-up a wall relief of one of the Anunnaki. You can see again the amazing detail. You can see symbolically his divinity by the horns on his head. Again, holding the fruit of life, the tree of life. We've got those two wrist devices again. Just very interesting detail for a culture coming right out of the Stone Age, literally popping up overnight with the first evidences of agriculture and science and astronomy and math. And everything they say they learned, they were taught by these beings. But modern archaeology isn't quite ready to accept ET. So that's the stopping point. But if you can get beyond that hurdle, again, this takes on a new light. Here's just another, a little bit more detail showing one of the Sumerian Anunnaki. Here he's holding like a deer or an antelope of some kind. But just the amazing detail that they have left us. This is a wall relief held in Iran. The colors and just the clarity. It's just very interesting that they were able to do all this without the aid of technology as we would like to think. Here's another cylinder seal that shows the god Ishtar, as I mentioned earlier. And again, not being a Sumerian linguist, I'm not able to translate these, but in looking at many of the cylinder seals over time, I've been able to distinguish certain key references like the winged disc, the Anunnaki, and they show up repeatedly. And one of those, of course, is this winged disc, the Anunnaki coming down on a winged disc. So the only thing that I interpret this as, you know, the Sumerians were seeing something happening at a time when the Sumerians actually did live amongst their living gods. Now, many questions arise. Why don't we see them today? Where have they gone? Were they actually ever here? And that's something that modern science is finally starting to catch up on for us to pinpoint specifically if we actually do have ancestors on another planet in our solar system, if that's even possible. So the information by the Sumerians really starts to take a new twist when we look at specifically their astronomical evidence speaking about where these gods come from, where the Anunnaki come from. And the Anunnaki came from another planet within our solar system, what the Sumerians described. This planet was called Nibiru. Nibiru in English just meant planet of the crossing. So an interesting, I think I have a slide in here somewhere, but an interesting thing to note is, you know, Christianity and using the symbolism of Jesus on the cross, the Sumerians depicted Nibiru as planet of the crossing 4,000 years before Christianity as the home of their gods. And this symbol, a cross, was transfigured and changed basically into further cultures as the winged disc. So what I'll show here is actually some of the cylinder seals and tablets where they actually talked about this ancient planet Nibiru. And here you can see one of the kings seated, and right above him is a cross in the sky, which was a symbolic reference of that planet Nibiru. And here, as I was just explaining, the top one you're looking at is a relief from a cylinder seal that showed during daylight hours the sun was glowing, but still very bright in the sky. There was a bright glowing cross. And this was a time when this planet, as the Sumerians described, was visible in the sky. Now, the Anunnaki very specifically explained the orbit of their home planet and how it was a part of our solar system. One of the things that was interesting about this information about our solar system is they described Earth as the 7th planet. They called it Ki. You know, the sacred number 7, 7 days in a week, 7 tablets of creation, actually, by the Sumerians. Like the Genesis has 7 days of creation. The Sumerians actually have 7 tablets, 7 stone tablets that explain our creation process. Interestingly enough, on this relief, here we see a symbol of the winged disc for Nibiru, and right next to it you see 7 dots, which is the symbol for Earth. So there are several reference points to show that the Sumerians described Earth as the 7th planet. And to put that into context, what we're looking at here is just an artist's rendition. But the Sumerians were aware of 12 planets. They counted the 9 planets that we know of, plus the sun, our moon, making 11, and then an additional planet, which they called Nibiru, which was way, way far beyond Pluto. Now, they gave a completed circle, an orbit of this planet. They called it a shar, and it was 3,600 years to go around one orbit of the sun. Our Earth, for instance, you know, a solar day here on Earth is 365 days. The Sumerians described a solar cycle for Nibiru as 3,600 years. So Nibiru only goes around our sun every 3,600 years. Long, long, elongated orbit, as they describe it. So just an interesting coincidence again, that if you count from coming outside the solar system in, we are actually on the 7th planet. Not the third rock from the sun, the hip term that we hear today, but if the Anunnaki were actually coming from outside our solar system in, and if you count from Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Earth is the 7th planet. Another interesting Sumerian artifact just shows, again, not being a Sumerian linguist, not sure the meaning of this other than I can recognize the symbology. Here we see an ancient depiction of Nibiru by the cross and its crescent moon, 7 dots of Earth and our crescent moon. Another interesting cylinder seal again, showing the 7 dots of Earth and the winged disc in another Sumerian stellar. And the interesting thing about the 7 dots, as we see here, when you go to the British Museum and the Louvre in Paris, in the descriptions by standard archaeology, these 7 dots are thought to be the 7 sisters of Pleiades. So the 7 stars of Pleiades. Now, Zecharia Sitchin and myself and many others don't follow the normal archaeological path of what the accepted explanation is. I'm more inclined to think of what Sitchin has said, that this is actually the 7 dots representing Earth, based upon all the information that we have bequeathed by the Sumerians. So here's a very interesting tablet that's gained quite a bit of popularity. Interestingly enough, you can see the date there. It's very, very old. And basically what it's showing is the Anunnaki king granting man the plow for modern agriculture, basically. But interesting, what we see at the top between those 2 gentlemen is a complete depiction of our solar system. So since the time of Copernicus and Galileo, man thought that Earth was the center of the universe, or the center of the galaxy, if you will. And it turns out that the Sumerians knew that the sun, and that we rotated around the sun thousands of years ago, depicting it accurately. They actually depicted all of the planets and the sizes of the planets correctly, and included one more planet as this additional 12th planet, Nibiru. So again, just from the time of Copernicus and Galileo, using mathematics, to gauge the distance between the planets and look at the information, both with telescopes and with mathematics, the Sumerians were aware of information that modern science is just now starting to catch up with. This is a very interesting artifact. One of the artifacts translated by Zecharia Sitchin. And another thing that archaeologists will tell you is that ancient man wasn't familiar with the ellipse, a circle. So here we have a Sumerian stone tablet, which is in the shape of an ellipse. And just this one section, where I've circled it red, Zecharia Sitchin has translated it to show some very interesting information. Very clearly, it's talking about which path the Anunnaki would take from their vicinity of where Nibiru was to our vicinity of where Earth was. And specifically in the translation, Zecharia Sitchin has shown that the key words here, you can see where I've labeled Nibiru for a mountainous planet, and the course correction where you can see the names of the planets that were listed, and on the sides it's like rocket, rocket, mountain, mountain, pile up, high, high, high. But if you count, there are 7 dots that it has to go by. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, until you arrive at the 7th planet, Earth. So, very interesting Sumerian artifact that specifically is telling us the course correction taken by the Anunnaki to get from Nibiru to Earth. Now, an interesting part of the information of the Sumerian lexicon is that they have, as I said, 7 tablets of creation. There's actually a very long tale called the Enuma Elish that very specifically explains how our solar system came to be, how Earth formed, and more specifically how we came about. The Sumerians speak of a time when our Earth hadn't even finished coalescing, 4.7 billion years, whatever, and an intruder planet appears, a rogue planet. As Zecharia Sitchin has translated it, this planet got pulled into the inner part of our solar system, let me go back one slide here for a minute, was pulled into the inner part of our solar system by the gravitational pull of the outer planets, was pulled in, and a collision took place that formed and sculpted our solar system to the way it is today. Now, one of those things on the modern science that has collaborated or shed some light on this type of theory is something that they call the Orpheus theory. And it was basically a show that they had on the Discovery Channel about a year ago that shows how they could have explained the formation of Earth's moon. And they said that a rogue planet at our distant point came in, whacked our primitive Earth, and in doing so, those debris coalesced to form our moon. Now, what's interesting about this story is it's very close to what the Sumerians describe of an ancient cataclysmic event between this planet called Nibiru and our once then called Tiamat, before it was our Earth. So what basically took place was Planet X, or Nibiru, is pulled into the inner part of our solar system, comes so close on the first pass to whacking Earth that on the next path, one of the moons of Nibiru, labeled North Wind, actually struck our primitive Earth, cracking it in half and strewing out the fragments to leave our asteroid belt. Now, this is what the Sumerians describe, and the English Bible tells you is the hammered out bracelet of God. So this is just a Sumerian description of what the English translations tell you, but much more detail. So they say that Nibiru, or Planet X, has this interaction with Earth and goes on to then have a 3,600 very elongated orbit around our sun. One of the interesting things that I've liked to point out is, Nibiru, when it passes by the inner part of our solar system, every 3,600 years, as the Sumerians are telling us, there has been evidence to show that there has been cataclysmic events based upon the interaction of this planet coming back into our solar system. Now, unfortunately, there was a lot of rumors spread a couple years ago about the return of this planet and what effects it might be causing or about to cause. And what I've liked to do to kind of squelch that rumor is show that basically we're talking 4.7 billion years ago when this initial collision took place. And if Nibiru has a 3,600-year orbit, we're looking at about over 1 million times Nibiru has completed that orbit. So I theorize that it might not be possible that every time Nibiru comes into the inner solar system that it has gravitational effects and cataclysmic events here on Earth. It could be coming in another part of the sun when we're way over here, and there might not be as great of an effect as there has been in the past. So I kind of like to squelch that rumor that it started right when it did by saying, no, a planet that the Sumerians described, which is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, that's how big Nibiru is in the descriptions, 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, will not be missed by amateur or professional astronomy. We have technology in place, which I'll show you, that is very accurate in being able to detect something that's planet-sized anywhere near our solar system. So again, one of those tablets that I was explaining that describe this long tale of how Earth's solar system came about, how Earth was formed. And interestingly enough, these are still stored in the British Museum on display. So one of the things I like to point out is to uphold the Sumerian information. If this interaction did take place, Nibiru whacked our primitive Earth, making it into half a planet, leaving the asteroid belt to be that fragment debris. Let me back up 1.2. I want to show you something. If you look here by the scale of the distance between the planets, how they're separated by their orbits, Nibiru orbits between Mars and Jupiter, where the asteroid belt is. And if you look at the space in between Mars and Jupiter, there looks to be enough room depicted by them for a planet to freely pass through there with enough space. Another just UFO reference that I just kind of speculating on. If any of you have heard of MJ12, this mysterious group MJ12, one of the things I've just thought was interesting is what we're talking about here is Nibiru passes between Mars and Jupiter, the 12th planet. Mars, Jupiter, 12th planet, MJ12. I don't know what that means, but I just thought it was kind of a neat little coincidence. Probably nothing. So if Earth is half a planet, if there was this initial interaction that took place and we're left with just basically half a chunk of land, well, where is the other half? So one of the things scientifically we can prove is that at one point, Earth was all one landmass, just a big one chunk of land. And just like the skin of an apple, the continents have spread out to where they are. But at some point, if it was just Pangea, one lump of land, that means where's the other half? Natural hyperdimensional physics, whatever, Earth's formed into a sphere. But all of the water is basically covering a huge basin that at one point was just a big gaping cavity. Where did that come from? So just showing that when we connect all the continents, it does show that Earth at one point was basically just one huge lump of land, kind of directly explaining what the Sumerians were saying of how this took place. So another interesting tablet that really has gotten a lot of publicity is the Flood tablet, stored in the British Museum. There was an archaeologist by the name of George Smith working with the British Museum in the early 1900s. He was able to translate and read cuneiform script, and threw his hands up, screaming, running out of the room in awe, could not believe that here he had found a tablet thousands of years before the Hebrew or the English version, telling the exact same story of Noah's Ark, of how a Sumerian man named Utenpism, it's a great word, Utenpism, I always find that name amazing. Hey, Utenpism, how you doing? Very clearly was told by an Anunnaki, a Sumerian god, to build a craft, take all the animals in his surrounding areas, his family, and put them into this craft. And it's the same story where he lets out the bird, brings back a branch. But this is told in a Sumerian version, thousands of years before the English Old Testament. So here's another interesting depiction of, again, in the English version of the Bible, we just have simply, there was a time before and after the deluge where there were giants upon the earth. I want to point out too that in this text, very specifically, they say why there was a great flood. Because Nibiru, in passing by, was going to crack off a large portion of the ice sheet in Antarctica and raise the water level significantly. Now the Anunnaki in their vast technology knew this. And there was a whole battle between the two rival Anunnaki gods, Enlil and Enki, one of them who liked us, one of them who didn't. And they said, no, man has become too numerous and is doing all these things that we don't like. Let him perish. It's, too bad. But after the great flood and the Anunnaki come back and they see man on this hilltop, they smell the burning flesh of meat that they're cooking, and they realize, wow, we actually need man more than we realized, because they give us the things that we need, food, they do our work for us. So it's a very interesting relationship that started to take place after the flood between man and our living gods. So one of the depictions again is giants upon the earth. Well, here we have a Sumerian wall relief that shows an Anunnaki seated and Sumerians worshiping him. Now I know from Sumerian descriptions the Anunnaki are genetically fit, very aesthetic. Some of them are described to be much larger, 6 to 8 feet, something like that. But we're not talking about like huge skeletons, giants. There have been a lot of rumors also on the internet that were basically photoshopped fake imagery that showed huge skeletons being removed from Saudi Arabia and various other places. This is not the case, folks. There have not been any skeletons found on Earth that we know of publicly that are like over 10 feet large, like a race of beings that existed. Now, it's not saying they didn't exist, but we have yet to find anything like that. So some of the information, again, collaborating the Sumerian knowledge and wealth, is that there has been pieces of artifacts found throughout history that just modern science can't explain. How could they have known this? One of those things is that they were able to accurately show the topography of the South and North Poles. And here we actually have a map that shows at one point the that North America and South America were all still connected. And interestingly enough, the topography of the land is accurately depicted. Now, we're talking miles and miles of ice on the Antarctic, in the subpolar regions, where you can't just look at it, or even from the sky know what the actual topography is. You have to use ground penetrating radar and actually know what the actual border is. But they were able somehow, in circulation in 1513, there was this famous admiral that had a map, Piri Reis, that showed very accurately the topography of North and South America, the routes that they were taken, and it's accurately depicting the topography of North and South Poles, which you can't do without ground penetrating radar. So the information that really has kicked my information of curiosity is, where is this home planet of the Anunnaki? Not to say that Planet X is coming back to kill us, or it's going to come, cause some catastrophic event. I'm more interested in the notion that what if we can actually prove through science that we have ancestors on another planet? That for me would be very interesting, to realize that our ancient gods at some point do actually exist, and there might be a time in our future when this interaction could take place again. So the search for Planet X has taken on the modern view that anything beyond Pluto, a body beyond Pluto, would be the 10th planet. That's the scientific view of X unknown, but numerically also meaning 10. So again, the research as Dr. Robert Harrington and Zecharia Sitchin collaborated on in the early 80s, Zecharia Sitchin had an orbital model, again from the Sumerian information, that showed a very elongated orbit, its path around the sun, and then the work of Dr. Harrington, where they collaborated on tape at the Naval Observatory, where Dr. Harrington would show his model for the Planet X that he was looking for, and how he believed that took place. And Zecharia Sitchin was just kind of collaborating and confirming that the notion for a body on a highly elongated orbit, 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, could be possible, that there could be a planet that has shown the effects on our solar system in the past, why Uranus is tilted, why various planets like Uranus and Neptune could have possibly been moons of Saturn that were detached and moved into their current position. All this disruption in our solar system was explained by the inclusion of another planet that caused all these effects. Now, the research of Dr. Harrington is very interesting. It's still stored online in many Harvard astronomical abstracts that you can look at. And he has several plates stored where he was showing in what regions of the sky we thought we should be looking for this planet. Here are some of those actual plates. And the interesting thing about this research about a rogue planet is that it's kind of a new idea, that science really didn't accept the idea of a planet in an egg-shaped, elongated orbit. They're like, well, we've never seen anything like this. How can it be possible? Well, as soon as we took an image of it, we thought, wow, I guess it is possible. So this is one of the first extrasolar planets, or excuse me, a planet around another star. This is not our solar system, a completely different planet and star, where the planet, here at the bottom you can see, its orbit around its star is a very elongated orbit. So this caught astronomers by surprise in the fact that, wow, it is possible for a planet to rotate around its star and have an elliptical orbit. So this information about a Nibiru, or a 10th planet, really caught on in the early 80s when we launched this infrared astronomical satellite. And of course, you know, the news always liking to jump to a conclusion. One of the things that they released in the 80s was a news article by the Washington Post saying, wow, Planet X has been found. But that actually wasn't the case. It was just the news interpreting it a little differently. But when they turned on this telescope and started to gather data, all of a sudden they were able to see out into space in a way that they couldn't before. And all of a sudden they saw all these large bodies floating around that they're like, whoa, we never saw these before. So the news instantly grabbed a hold of that and said, well, one of these is a Planet X. We don't know which one yet. We still have to map out the orbits and stuff, catalog them. But they quickly jumped on that bandwagon and said, oh, they found it, you know. So there's been a large duration of viewing the sky now, where we've released all kinds of satellites to do, you know, imaging in the sky for looking for brown dwarfs, failed suns, rogue planets, all these things that we weren't able to penetrate on a temperature level through the dust clouds and various other things to see these large objects. But now we're finally starting to get the science released, where consistently news has been coming out over the last decade that yes, something beyond the outer planets of Pluto is affecting the orbits, or is being detected as a mystery revolving around the sun. What could it be? And even to this day, we have misinformation or speculation about the 10th planet being found. Now NASA, again, their standpoint is anything beyond Pluto, 9, it's the 10th. But what I'm looking for, and what I will continue to prognosticate as the 10th planet, if it ever is found, would have to be a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, a big planet. So if we are to find a planet like that, that will really get on my radar as, here's something we need to watch out for, because very specifically, we could have ancestors on that planet. Now, some of the technology that we have out there now that we've just started to, you know, launch and utilize will be able to detect planets such as 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. This is a telescope called the SIRTIF telescope. When they first launched this, I went to a seminar at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories and met with one of the lead astronomers on the project. Her name is Dr. Michelle Fowler. And I asked her point blank, do you believe that an object 4 to 8 times the size of the Earth could exist in our solar system, but we just haven't detected it yet? And she said, yes, I do. But this telescope is going to focus in on very specific points in the sky. It's not like this one. We look back here. Let me go back a couple slides. I missed it. The wire was a very wide angle array, so it didn't really go out as far, but it would be able to see a lot of information at once. Whereas the SIRTIF can hone in on a very specific point and gather very, very accurate detail. The information, like this image that we're seeing below here, the information released by the SIRTIF was just unbelievable in the detail that they were able to get. Here's what they would normally see in visible light up at the top. When they turn on the SIRTIF and all of a sudden use all the new instruments on board this, now all of a sudden all those little red dots you see highlighted, those are all stars. These are all new information that's being able to be bequeathed by these telescopes because of the level of technology that we're quickly approaching. So what's happened over the last few years is that they're starting to use these telescopes to detect things beyond Pluto. And the first one that popped up was this thing called Quoar, and then they had Sedna. But as you'll see here in the diameter of what we're talking about, these are small objects. You know, these are just floating chunks of ice basically out there, and I don't really know what their actual makeup is. The latest one that they just found called Xena, they're really not even sure if its actual mass is larger than Pluto, but it's something that they've, you know, detected in their, still doing research on. But again, it's not the ancient planet X that my research is interested in. It's not a planet that's 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. It's just a little hunk of ice out there. So, a lot of the technology we have, another one, this is a really great telescope out in Hawaii, the Keck interferometer, where it can take 2 independent lenses and focus up at a point in space and super amplify this data so that they can overexpose the image and really get a clear picture of what they're looking at. And again, this is technology that we have all over the Earth from a professional standpoint, but there's also amateur astronomy taking place where, for the most part, like Hale-Bopp and some of these other discoveries, things are spotted by amateur astronomers before the professional community. It's pretty interesting. Now, the public at large, amateur-wise, I'm sure there's a lot of information about our solar system and about our planets that isn't in the public realm, like I'm showing you the Keck and the Surdif. But trust me, folks, there's a lot more out there that we have, military-wise and black budget-wise, where they're collecting information and doing things in space that we just have no clue about. So this is, again, just another diagram explaining in size and duration for when we talk about brown dwarfs or a failed star or something like that. You see here Jupiter. So the masses of the bodies that we're looking out and looking for in space and being able to catalog are really quite phenomenal in size. And as I touched on in my lecture earlier, this idea of a threat from space really isn't something new. Again, all the way back from the time of the Sumerians talking about their ancient interaction with Nibiru, there is very possible a threat from space that over the last few years, Armageddon, Deep Impact, the media taking notice to this. There's also been a lot of evidence scientifically released, 2028, Toitus, all these different asteroids and things with the Near-Earth Object Program, that they're starting to really start to pay attention to the possibility of us getting whacked by an object. And as I showed earlier again, this impact that took place with Shoemaker-Levy 9 was very dramatic. And if, a piece of a fragment the size that hit Jupiter were to come anywhere near us, we would be toast. Luckily, we have Jupiter. It's a very large gravity, pulls in many of the debris that might hit us, gets pulled into Jupiter. So it's nice that we have it. But again, we do have enough information to show that by the extinction of the dinosaurs or various other things, that if we are subject to be whacked by some of this debris, it could be a dark day for us on Earth. Now, I will point out this too, in my own personal opinion, from the ufology side, I think that for a long time, through the code word like the Star Wars program and stuff like that, they're not shooting down missiles. They're shooting down things that are coming in, whether that be alien spacecraft, which to some degree I believe. But it's very possible that we already have in place the technology to fend off asteroids and stuff like that. Why it's not publicly talked about, don't know. But my personal opinion is that there is technology in place so that we won't get taken out by an asteroid. Can't confirm that though. So again, just deep impact, all this stuff where it's starting to raise the public awareness of beyond just your job, raising your kids. There are stuff in the heavens, as we saw from Hale-Bopp, that all of a sudden these things can appear in our skies and can cause an effect. So again, we need that killer prevention plan just in case there aren't the tools in place. It is a good public awareness for us to at least understand how this has been a part of our history. One of the interesting scientists, Dr. Richard Mueller, out of the University of California, has been doing some significant research showing that what he believes is what he calls as a nemesis, that there's another failed star out there, well beyond the Oort cloud, that there's debris orbiting that cloud that gets pushed on cyclic events, millions of years, not 3,600 years like Nibiru's orbit, but millions of years, this cyclic event takes place where debris gets pushed to the inner part of our solar system and could be subject to whacking us. Here's one of the depictions showing this Nemesis star, which would be like on the other side of our solar system, and that we would, there would be an object that could orbit between both of those suns. So for instance, if we have a planet X, let's say, a Nibiru, it's very possible, through the work of like the Hubble telescope, imaging other solar systems, we see that a lot of them are binary, having two suns. So it's very possible that our solar system is also binary, but our sun, our second sun, is a failed sun, sitting way out there in space. But again, the event that takes place is that there is debris that's cycling around that failed sun and comes also back into our vicinity. And Dr. Mueller said that this happened on a cyclic event that took place over millions of years. So again, another one of the asteroids being tracked in Earth's vicinity was this asteroid called 4179 Toides. And it was just very interesting that, again, there are asteroids being plotted that, for what they call to be like a really, 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 really close asteroid would be anything passing between the distance of the Earth and our moon. It doesn't happen very often, but if an asteroid does pass between the Earth and our moon, that is kind of like the window of like red alert. So they have been detecting some of these, and we've sent out probes and orbiters. We actually landed on a comet just recently, which was a very interesting accomplishment. But we take infrared, we take instrument readings and try and analyze the orbital path of how this asteroid is spinning to see if we can plot if it's ever going to be on a collision course with Earth. So some of the other interesting points, as I'll start to wrap it up here, are the Sumerians had another very interesting aspect of the artifacts that they left, where they had depictions of what the Sumerian gods called Igigi. Now these were also Anunnaki. Anunnaki and Igigi are two words basically meaning the same thing. Igigi were the Anunnaki that stayed up aboard the craft. And the Sumerians wrote specifically that these Igigi had helpers that helped them and would sometimes come to Earth, would fly their craft, or would relay information by the Anunnaki to the people. And interestingly enough, these depictions of these helpers look just like our modern day gray aliens. And these are artifacts, again, that we have on display and have been held in the museums around the world. And the Sumerians described these as helpers of the Anunnaki. And that there were actually texts that would tell you how you could interact with this being to find out whether or not it was actually alive or not. Because they said that some of these beings acted as though they were alive but clearly weren't. So for me, how do I interpret that as other than it was probably an android or some type of hybrid being that the Anunnaki created? Another depiction of these helpers. So it's just a very interesting coincidence when we look at the bulbous heads, the oval-shaped eyes, and the connection or the correlation to the same things that we have now with UFO reports and the aliens being abducted, or humans being abducted by these grays. And one of the things I'd like to point out is, we can't in the time completely cover this information, but one of the big points of the Anunnaki and their tale bequeathed to the Sumerians is, again, they were their living gods. So God, in that official sense, was the Anunnaki explained that they basically took the pre-hominoid man, the Neanderthal man, that was evolving here naturally, and took 20% of their genes and 80% of the Anunnaki gene to create us in their image and after their likeness. Just like the Bible says, word for word. So it's a very interesting tale that the Sumerians tell us the Anunnaki created us to be workers, like a slave race, to mine the gold out of southern Africa. The Anunnaki originally coming here needed to repair Nibiru's atmosphere. Now again, this is all written down in Sumerian text, very detailed explanation. The Sumerians say the Anunnaki came here originally seeking gold and other fine precious elements to repair their atmosphere. So when they first started doing this excavation of the gold, roughly 300,000 years ago in southern Africa, they found out this is a very toiling job. They didn't like having to do it, so they created a worker race, us. And there are several Sumerian depictions and tablets that show, just like in the Adam and Eve tale in English, there is an actual Sumerian tale of where one of the Anunnaki scientists, her name was Ninharsad, created the first perfect working model, and she called it the atom. And in Hebrew, there's a word called Adamu, which means worker. So it's not in English like Adam as a name. It was Adamu as a worker. And there's an actual cylinder seal where she's holding up this being, and she says, my hands have made it. And the tale goes on to tell where the first version, the arm didn't work, the kidney didn't function, until finally they had the perfect working model. So the interesting connection I show between these helpers and today's modern day UFO depictions is, I think it's very possible, if the Anunnaki did create us in their image and after their likeness, that they could have another race of beings, a hybrid race, that they may have created or spliced their genes with, that are here now kind of overseeing us or kind of watching their grand experiment. And the reason why I say that is, a lot of times when people report alien abduction, they're taken on a craft, there's reproductive fluids taken, it's basically like a medical examination that takes place. So it's very possible that they're taking this information, gathering it, and relaying it back to the Anunnaki about how their grand experiment of us is coming along. Now I would have to kind of speculate in saying, why don't we see the aliens today? Where are all the aliens? Why are the UFOs such a hush-hush topic? And my own personal opinion on it is that I feel like the public at large is being desensitized to this information. I started my research, again, 10, 11 years ago, and as a college student, I learned how to approach this information by having to be up here and telling you about it, because suffering the ridicule of coming to my peers and other, college students at the time and saying, this is true, this is going on, all this information is true. The government isn't going to come straight out and tell us this. And my own personal opinion is that there's probably some type of galactic federation of planets or a conglomerate race of beings, like we see depicted in Star Wars or Star Trek, for what have you, that for whatever reason, we are on quarantine. They are not allowed to come here, because we need to be pushed ever so slightly in our own way to make these changes for ourselves. Quit blowing up the planet, quit killing each other, quit expelling natural resources. What are we going to do with more technology on a whole, other than to misuse it? So my personal opinion is that the reason why we're not seeing outright alien interaction as described very clearly by the ancient texts is that we are now facing a time when we're being nudged in the direction to join that community. But we have to do it on our own, and those steps need to be taken on an evolutionary process. So I just personally think that we've never been alone, and that hopefully, if we can, as an Earth civilization, get our stuff together, maybe these events will take place again in our lifetime. So I'll go ahead and end it here, and I would say that all the information that I've showed you and any of the topics that I discussed are freely available on my website, xfax.com. And I would encourage you to go and look at some of these artifacts. Again, I have over 500 digital images showing the Sumerian artifacts in detail, where hopefully in some point in our future, as we start to learn more about our past, we can really start to realize where we do come from. Thank you very much.